The University of the Western Cape. Professor Mngomzulu, thank you so much for your time this morning. We know that the king was...
Thank you for having me.
We know that the king was not King Cyprian's son. Talk to us about the Zulu lineage.
No, I think that the King Goodwill Zwelithini was the son of Cyprian Zulu, and we know that he assumed the office in 1971 following the passing of his father. And there had been other leaders before him, of course, King Pande, King Cetshwayo, and many others, starting from King Senzangakona, King Shaka, who built the Zulu nation. So of all the kings that have ruled present-day KwaZulu-Natal, the late King Isilo Goodwill Zwelithini is the one who has been in office the longest, because his father was in office for only 35 years. So then basically looking at the history of the Zulu lineage, I would say that of all the Zulu kings who have ruled the Zulu nation, the late King Goodwill Zwelithini is one who has in fact set a new trend in the Zulu history. One, for having been the longest reigning king, but secondly, for having been a king presiding over a relatively peaceful nation, and he has tried his level best to also revive some of the cultural practices that the Zulus were known for. So I would say that on many fronts, the late King Goodwill Zwelithini Zulu has been one of the first in those regards.
Before we go on to the second question, I just want to apologize because I just took the questions as they came in, but apologies for putting it incorrectly there. The king at a young age was an IFP supporter, but later changed to ANC when the ANC was unbanned. Take us through this history.
Yes, it's a very interesting history, and in most instances, this history is generally misconstrued. First of all, we will know that what is now called the IFP, Inkatha Freedom Party, was in fact started by Inkosi King Dinizulu in 1922, and it was called the Inkatha Cultural Movement. Its primary objective was to preserve Zulu culture. And then when the ANC was unbanned in 1961 following the formation of Umkhonto weSizwe on the 16th of December, there was a discussion between the leadership of the ANC and the leadership of Inkatha at the time. In fact, at the time, there was no Inkatha, to be exact. And then Inkosi Mangosuthu Buthelezi was then tasked by the ANC, of which he was a member, by the way, and then he was tasked by the ANC to form a movement that was going to be the face of the ANC in the ANC's absence in South African politics. What then happened is that after those discussions, an agreement was reached that Inkosi Mangosuthu Buthelezi was going to revive the cultural movement, which was formed in 1922, disguising it, of course, to be a cultural movement, when in actual fact, he was going to be advancing whatever the ANC would have wanted to do. That is why most people don't understand this, that on many occasions, Umntwana, that is Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, visited Lusaka, where the headquarters of the ANC was, to touch base with the ANC leadership, because he was basically representing the ANC in its absentia. So when the Inkatha was formed in 1975, it was formed within that political context. So with the Zulu king then being one of the custodians of Zulu culture, there was no way that you would take him away from Inkatha cultural movement. So he was part and parcel of that. So then during the Bantustan period, when a number of Bantustans were formed, the KwaZulu government did not want to be part of that. But then, of course, KwaZulu legislature was formed, or KwaZulu government was formed, and then Inkosi Mangosuthu Buthelezi presided over that. And the problem or the confusion arises because Umntwana, that is Prince Buthelezi, was associated with Inkatha on the one hand, was associated with the ANC on the other, but was also associated with the Zulu nation because he is Undunankulu KwaZulu, whilst he was also presiding over KwaZulu government. So wearing those different hats, therefore, meant that you could not take the Zulu king away from Inkatha, and then people assumed that he was a full member of Inkatha, when in actual fact, it was because of this complex situation. And as a result, there was no way that the Zulu King would leave the country without getting a green light from the then KwaZulu government. And this continued for quite a long time, for as long as KwaZulu government existed. And as a result, some of the members and the leaders of the ANC who didn't understand this history assumed that the Zulu King was in fact a diehard member of Inkatha, which was not actually the case. It was only that his affairs were run from Ulundi. And therefore, it was easier for others to associate him with Inkatha. So that when in the 1990s then, the ANC was unbanned and came back into the country, there was a squabble, so to speak, between Inkatha and the ANC. Some were saying that because at the time, the security detail of the Zulu King was provided for by the ZP, the Zulu police, who were associated with Inkatha. And then they said, by that alone, it meant that the Zulu King was therefore representing the interests of Inkatha, which was not the case. So then the ANC leadership said, no, he must in fact be protected by the South African police. And would recall that in the 1990s, 1992 to early 1994 to be exact, there was that misunderstanding between the operations of the ZP, the Zulu police, and the operations of the SAP, which are now referred to as the SAPS. So that is basically the brief history which associates the Zulu King with Inkatha, which I say was the mouthpiece of the ANC until, of course, the ANC came back and then it became an independent entity, and then it became Inkatha Freedom Party as we know it today.
So now the King's departure happens at a time when the land debate is still raging. Talk to us about how Ingonyama Trust came to being and what is likely to happen to the trust now that the King is not here anymore.
That is one of the hot potatoes. And in fact, I was impressed yesterday when I was listening to Inkosi from Gwandebele, going back to that history. And in fact, he was saying that of all the kings in South Africa, the Zulu King is one king who has defended his land up to the last bit. And if you recall well, during the CODESA talks, Inkosi Mangosuthu in his capacity, both as the leader of Inkatha and also as the Zulu Prince, in fact, he said that he was not going to continue with the negotiations for as long as the Zulu King was not accorded a place in the new political dispensation. And at one point, he even pulled out of the negotiations until such time that Prof Okumu from Kenya came back and then tried to reason with him, and eventually he even agreed to participate in the 1994 general elections. And as people would recall, Inkatha was not on the ballot paper, and the name of the IFP had to be appended at the end after the negotiations were arrived at the 11th hour. And that then tells you that the issue of land has been on the cards for a very long time. During CODESA talks, it was one of the thorny issues because Prince Buthelezi was saying that you can get political freedom, but as long as you don't have access to land, such political freedom will amount to nothing. So then this idea then of Ingonyama Trust came within that particular political context. There was an agreement that certain pieces of land in present-day KwaZulu-Natal will be under the custodians of Isilo, that is Ingonyama Trust, who would preside over that particular land on behalf of the Zulu subjects. And then some people have interpreted it in political terms, saying that basically what the Zulu King did was undemocratic, forgetting the history behind Ingonyama Trust. It might well be true that some things might have gone wrong after Ingonyama Trust had been established, because then individuals will always grab the opportunity and use it for whatever reason. But the reality of the matter is Ingonyama Trust was established within a clear political context, which was to make sure that the Zulu history is not cleared from the history books. With the king then having passed on, as we say, Ingonyama Ikoteme. So this then raises some questions as to what will happen with Ingonyama Trust. You would recall that there was a time when former acting president Kgalema Motlanthe was tasked to oversee this particular issue, Ingonyama Trust. And I was one of the people who raised issues about the credibility of former acting president Kgalema Motlanthe looking over the land issues, because I was saying that first of all, I don't think he understands how land is in fact taken in the interest. In the context of African custom in general and Zulu custom and then specifically. You would recall that when he presented his report afterwards, he created a wrong impression that traditional leaders from the Eastern Cape, for example, were more reasoning or more reasonable compared to those in KwaZulu-Natal. And I was happy because traditional leaders from the Eastern Cape said, no, this can't be right. We are members of Contralesa and we all read from the same script. Whatever views that the Zulu King has, whatever views that traditional leaders from KwaZulu-Natal have, we also have, because land is a key issue. So I would say that even though the king is no more, whoever is going to succeed the king must take over from where the king left off and consider this history. Because if you bring emotions on this land issue and take away the historical part of it, you are going to miss the point, and then things will get out of hand. So I would say it all depends on what happens from now on. But from where I'm standing, I think that the Zulu King has done well in terms of defending the land that belonged to the Zulu people, and then made sure that this land had to be used for the interests of the Zulu people and not to be used for any other reason. Because if you look at East Africa, for example, Custodians of the Land, which is the book that is one of the most prominent books on land issues, it talks to that you can get political freedom, but if you don't have access to land, you basically having a battle that is half won, and then you still have to fight even more to make sure that you have access to land. I would say that we'll see what happens when his successor is announced, and then, of course, if that successor is prepared to go to history and dig out what happened in order to understand what is currently happening as far as this particular issue is concerned, the land issue is concerned.
Am I to gather from what you say that the Kgalema Motlanthe report on land needs to be revised?
Absolutely. From where I'm standing, first of all, as I say, I was not happy about how that particular commission was constituted, because at one point I was raising a question. How can you bring someone who didn't grow up in a rural area and say that person must oversee this process? Because as much as you need the academic know-how of this particular issue, you also need someone who has lived experience. Those of us, for example, who grew up in rural areas, who still reside in rural areas and only go to urban areas for job purposes, we understand traditional practices. That is one of the reasons, for instance, why I've been critical whenever some of my colleagues in the academic space were saying that you cannot, in fact, have traditional leaders under the new political dispensation. One of the known authors on land issues, for example, wrote a book saying democracy compromised, and he was saying that you cannot have traditional leaders in a democratic dispensation. I took that matter on and wrote a review article saying that if you say that, you are missing the point, because land is of essence in as far as Africans are concerned. And in fact, even the democratic practices that we talk about right now, they were there in the old order. It's just people who don't understand how the traditional system of governance operated who will tell you that African leaders were despots. They even fail to understand that even in Eswatini, if you look at King Mswati, there is what is called the inner council, Likoko Lagangwane. And then there is Libandla Lagangwane. That is where issues are discussed. So it means if the king, the reigning king, goes astray, there are processes in place to bring that person into order. So then I would say that looking at how the commission was constituted, how research was conducted, how the recommendations were made, I have issues with that. In fact, I'll be one of the proponents of that report being reviewed, and then all the wrongs being corrected, so that we have a better sense of what a traditional culture is all about, of what traditional leaders are set to do and what they've been doing. Then we'll be in a better position to make recommendations that will be binding and that will bring people together as opposed to saying traditional leaders are despots and then elected leaders are in fact democratic, which is not the case, because some of the democratically elected leaders are more despotic than some of our traditional leaders. I think there is some education that needs to happen, including our government officials, some of whom, in fact, in my view, are a disgrace because they are Africans, but they have no clue as to how to deal with traditional issues. And then they come and dismiss traditional leadership structures as if we've just mushroomed from nowhere under colonialism and apartheid, and then we have to embrace everything Western. You can retain African traditions without necessarily dismissing anything Western. These two have to complement each other, but you can't dismiss traditional leaders and say they were despots and therefore you want everybody to be elected through a democratic process, because there are issues on both sides of the equation.
What important conversations we're having right now. But just to wrap up our conversation, we know there's a series of rituals. We've been told there's a series of rituals and customs that will be observed from now until the king is laid to rest. Just in talking to us about some of these customs, talk to us about how they either harmonize or are in contradiction with, for instance, the President Cyril Ramaphosa has declared a special official funeral for the king. Is this in contradiction to the customs?
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say so. There is a point of convergence between traditional practices and modern democratic practices. Like, for example, the late king himself, on the issue of circumcision, he demonstrated to us that these two can in fact live side by side. When he revived an old custom of circumcision and said, I'm reviving this custom, but we can have it operating at our modern hospitals. So it was him embracing a modernity while at the same time retaining cultural practices. Under normal circumstances, when the reigning king is unwell, we normally say inkosi iyadunguzela. And then once the king passes on, normally you don't inform the nation that the king has passed on. You keep it close to the family and then attend to all the necessary rituals that need to be taken care of, including, of course, confirming who the successor will be. That is to ensure that there is no vacuum once an announcement is made. Then at that particular time, what will then happen before the king is then laid to rest, which we normally say, inkosi iyatshalwa. We don't necessarily say the king is being buried. Inkosi iyatshalwa. What would then happen in that case is that not everyone would attend the funeral, but only inner members of the inner circle of the royal family will be attending that particular funeral. In this case, we are living in a modern world. Of course, the president, that is President Cyril Ramaphosa, what he's doing is what any other president would have done, including, of course, declaring this particular burial to be a category 1. Then, in fact, it's in line with the current political dispensation. But in doing so, government has to be in constant touch with the royal house, and more particularly with Inkosi Buthelezi, who is representing the Zulu nation and the Zulu family, and ask him traditionally how are things done, so that then the government processes will kick in, but at the same time the Zulu cultural practices will not be taken out of the picture. Because the moment you do that, you are basically depriving the Zulu people of their identity, and you are depriving Africans of their identity. So I would say that there is nothing amiss with the government getting involved, while at the same time making sure that traditional practices are being brought in. That is why we normally say Africanization and internationalization are not in fact antithetical to each other. You can have both as long as both parties understand what constitutes traditionalism, what constitutes modernity, and then you find a point of convergence, and then there will be no problem.
Lagadla, masikubonge for your time this morning.
No, thank you very much, my sister. Ngiyabonga nami to talk to you and to talk to your listeners. Thank you very much.